In a small, quiet village tucked away in the rolling green hills of Austria, the mornings usually started with the sound of cowbells, the heavy rumble of wooden carts, and the loud greetings of neighbors. But for one young boy, the world was a movie played with the sound turned completely off. His name was Thomas. He was 10 years old, with messy brown hair and eyes that seemed to look right through people. Not because he was rude, but because he was searching for clues. Thomas was deaf. He had never heard a bird sing. He had never heard the rain tap against the window pane. He had never heard his own mother's voice tell him that she loved him. To the people in the village, Thomas was a puzzle they didn't quite know how to solve. They would wave their hands in front of his face or speak very slowly, shouting words that just floated away into the air like smoke. Thomas would just smile a shy, crooked smile and nod, pretending he understood, but mostly he just felt alone. He lived in a glass box, watching life happen on the outside, safe but completely separated. Because he couldn't hear, his other senses worked overtime. His eyes were constantly darting around, catching the flicker of a candle or the sudden movement of a cat. His skin was sensitive to the changing wind. But there was one thing in that old, drafty house that called to him more than anything else. It sat in the corner of the dusty parlor, covered in a thick layer of white cloth like a sleeping ghost. It was an old, upright piano. It had been there for years, ignored by everyone, its keys yellowing with age. Thomas was fascinated by it. He didn't know what music was. He didn't know about melodies or harmonies or scales. All he knew was that this big wooden box had a secret. One afternoon, when the house was empty and the sun was slicing through the curtains in thick beams of dust, Thomas walked into the parlor. He tiptoed across the creaky floorboards, his heart beating a little faster. He reached out and pulled the cloth away. The piano looked back at him, stern and serious. He sat down on the small, padded bench. It was hard and uncomfortable. He looked at the rows of black and white keys. They looked like teeth in a giant mouth. Thomas took a deep breath. He lifted his right hand and hovered it over the keys. He didn't know where to put his fingers, so he just pushed down on a white key in the middle. Thump. Thomas didn't hear the sound, but he felt it. It was a sharp jolt that traveled from his fingertips, up his arm, and into his shoulder. It was a physical punch, but it didn't hurt. It felt live. He pressed another key. Clunk. Then a black key. Ping. Thomas gasped. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just watching the world. He was touching it. He realized that if he put his hands on the wood, he could feel the notes buzzing against his palms. He pressed 2 keys at the same time, and the vibration grew stronger, shaking his wrists. It was like talking without speaking. He pressed his ear against the cold wood of the piano and hit the low keys with his fist. The wood trembled against his cheekbone, buzzing like a giant bee. He spent the rest of the afternoon there. He forgot about the time. He forgot about the loneliness. He hit the keys gently, then he hit them hard. He learned that the heavy keys made the floor shake, while the light keys felt like a tickle. He closed his eyes and let his hands wander. It wasn't a song, not really. It was just noise to anyone else, a chaotic banging of keys. But to Thomas, it was a conversation. He was asking the piano questions, and the piano was answering him back in rumbles and ticks. His mother found him. There hours later, when the sun was going down, at first, she was annoyed to see the old instrument being abused. She started to scold him, waving her hands angrily, telling him to stop making a mess, but then she stopped. She saw the look on his face. Thomas wasn't banging on the piano to break it. He was hunched over, his eyes closed, a look of pure peace on his face. He was humming a low, gravelly sound that didn't match any tune, trying to match the vibration in his chest. His mother lowered her hands. She watched him press a key, feel the buzz, and then smile. She realized then that Thomas wasn't broken. He just found a different way to listen. She didn't stop him. She quietly left the room and left him to his discovery. From that day on, Thomas was obsessed. Every chance he got, he was at that piano. He stopped seeing it as a wooden box and started seeing it as an extension of himself. He realized that the piano had rules. If he pressed a key, the piano answered. If he pressed a group of keys together, it felt happy. If he pressed them slowly, it felt sad. He began to understand the physics of the sound. He learned that if he took off his shoes and socks, he could feel the deep bass notes traveling through the floorboards and into the soles of his feet. He started to experiment. He would put his hand on the soundboard at the back of the piano, the large wooden sheet that made the noise. Try to sing. He couldn't hear his own voice, so he sang too loud or too low, making a strange guttural noise. But when he hit the right note, the piano would sing back to him. The wood would vibrate in harmony with his throat. It gave him a shiver every single time. It was his favorite feeling in the world. The other kids in the village didn't understand. They would look in the window and see him banging away, sometimes with a goofy look on his face, and they would laugh. They didn't know he was feeling things they couldn't. They could hear the music, but Thomas was inside the music. He could feel the waves of the air moving. He could feel the tension of the wires inside the piano. He was dancing with the instrument, and they were just watching the dance. But Thomas didn't care about the laughing kids. He had a secret world now. When he sat on that bench, the silence that had ruled his entire life disappeared. The emptiness was filled with shaking, quaking, trembling life. He wasn't the deaf boy anymore. He was a conductor, and the vibrations were his orchestra. He didn't know how to read music, and he didn't know the names of the composers who had written songs hundreds of years ago. He only knew what his hands told him. He began to get better. His fingers, which used to be clumsy and stiff, started to move with a purpose. He learned that if he hit a key and held it, the vibration lasted longer. He learned how to make the piano whisper by pressing the keys softly so the wood only hummed a little bit. He spent his evenings feeling his way through the darkness of the silence. Lighting it up with every press of a key, his mother watched him change. The boy who used to sulk in the corner now had a spark in his eyes. He walked with more confidence. He woke up early, eager to get back to the parlor. She didn't have the heart to tell him that he was playing wrong. She didn't have the heart to tell him that music was supposed to be heard, not felt, because she could see that he was doing something special. He was turning his disability into a superpower. While others heard the music, Thomas was becoming the music. One rainy afternoon, the village school teacher, a strict woman named Frau Weber, came by the house to drop off some books for Thomas's mother. As she stood in the hallway, taking off her wet coat, she heard the piano. At first she thought it was just the wind banging against the house, or maybe a cat walking across the keys. But then she recognized a pattern. It was simple, and it was a bit messy, but it was rhythmic. She walked quietly to the door of the parlor and peeked inside. She saw Thomas sitting there. He wasn't looking at his hands. He was looking up at the ceiling, his hands moving across the keys by memory, his feet pressing the pedals that made the sound long and deep. He looked like he was in a trance. Frau Weber knew music. She had played the organ in the church for 20 years. She knew that playing the piano required an ear for pitch, something Thomas was supposed to completely lack. She watched him play a simple melody, something he must have heard hummed by someone, or maybe something he had made up entirely. It wasn't perfect, but the timing was precise. He never missed a beat. She stepped into the room. Thomas didn't notice her. He couldn't hear her footsteps. She walked up behind the piano and stood there, listening and watching. She saw him press his foot down on the loud pedal, and the room seemed to shake. He hit a low note with his left hand and a high note with his right, creating a vibration that made the water in the glass on top of the piano ripple. Frau Weber felt a chill run down her spine. She realized that this boy wasn't just guessing. He was memorizing the feeling of the notes. He had taught himself a language without sound. She cleared her throat even though she knew he wouldn't hear her. She reached out and tapped him gently on the shoulder. Thomas jumped, nearly falling off the bench. He spun around, his face flushed with surprise and embarrassment. He thought he was in trouble for making noise again. He looked down at his hands, waiting to be scolded, but Frau Weber didn't scold him. She pulled a chair over and sat down next to him. She took his hands in hers. They were rough and calloused from the hard ivory keys. She looked him in the eyes and spoke slowly, making sure he could read her lips. She said, "Play for me again." Thomas looked at her unsure. but then he saw the kindness in her eyes. He turned back to the piano. He placed his hands on the keys. He took a deep breath, feeling the air rush into his lungs, and he began to play. And for the first time in his life, someone was watching him, not with pity, but with wonder. The silent world was suddenly full of possibilities. The discovery of Thomas's talent changed the quiet rhythm of the village house. Frau Weber, the schoolteacher, became a regular visitor. At first, she just came to listen, sitting in the corner with her eyes closed, letting the strange, rhythmically perfect sounds fill the room. But soon, she started bringing him sheets of paper. They were covered in little black dots and lined strange symbols that looked like ants marching across the page. Thomas had never seen them before. To him, music was something you felt in your fingers and your chest. It's not something you read from a book. At first, he was frustrated. He wanted to just play. He wanted to feel the vibrations. But Frau Weber was patient, though she was strict. She would tap the paper, point to a note, and then play it on the piano for him. She would grab his hands and make him hold the key down until the vibrations stopped, forcing him to memorize the feeling of every single note. It was hard work. It was like learning a new language when you had never even heard a word spoken. Weeks turned into months. Thomas's fingers began to toughen up. They moved faster and with more confidence. Frau Weber realized something incredible. Because Thomas couldn't hear, he didn't have the bad habits that other students had. He didn't rely on his ear to tell him if a note was slightly off. He relied on the perfect memory in his muscles. If a note didn't vibrate the right way against his fingertips, he knew it was wrong. He played with a mechanical precision that was almost scary, but he also played with a deep, raw emotion because he was so desperate to express himself. One cold evening, as the snow began to fall outside the window, Frau Weber arrived at the house with a serious look on her face. She wasn't carrying her usual lesson books. She held a single piece of paper with official-looking stamps on it. She sat Thomas down and looked at his mother. "There is a competition," she said slowly, making sure Thomas's mother understood every word. "In the big city, the best players from all over the region will be there. It is a very serious event. Experts will be there, critics." Thomas's mother shook her head nervously. She looked at Thomas, who was sitting on the piano bench, swinging his legs. He was just a boy from a small village. He couldn't hear. How could he compete in a world built on sound? "He is special," Frau Weber insisted. She turned to Thomas. She didn't treat him like a child. She treated him like a musician. "They will laugh," she told him honestly. "They will look at you and think you cannot play. They will be cruel." Thomas's face fell. He looked down at his shoes. He was used to being laughed at, but it still hurt. "But," Frau Weber continued, lifting his chin so he had to look at her, "if you play, they will stop. If you let the music speak, they will have to listen." Thomas looked at the piano. He thought about the vibrations, the way the music shook the floorboards. He thought about the silence he lived in every day. He nodded once. He wanted to go. The preparations were intense. Frau Weber chose a difficult piece for him. It was a composition by Beethoven, a man who Thomas was surprised to learn had also lost his hearing. It was a complicated, stormy song full of ups and downs. Thomas practiced until his hands ached. He practiced until his mother had to put a blanket over his hands to make him stop for the night. He didn't just learn the notes. He memorized the exact weight of each key. He learned how much pressure was needed to make the piano sing and how much would make it scream. Finally, the day of the trip arrived. Thomas had never been to the city before. The journey was a blur. He watched the landscape change from green fields to gray cobblestones. When they arrived, the city was overwhelming. There were carriages clattering over the stones, people shouting in the streets, the deafening roar of machinery that Thomas could feel rumbling through the soles of his shoes. It was chaotic and scary. But Frau Weber held his hand tight and guided him through the crowds. They arrived at the Grand Hall. It was a massive building made of stone and glass, towering over the street. Inside, it was even more impressive. The ceilings were so high they seemed to touch the clouds. Chandeliers hung like giant cages of light. There were red velvet curtains everywhere, and polished floors that shone like mirrors. Thomas felt very small and very dusty in his simple clothes. He clutched Frau Weber's hand, his eyes wide. She led him backstage. The air was thick with tension. There were other children there, boys and girls dressed in their finest suits and dresses. They looked rich and polished. Some were warming up on practice pianos in other rooms, the sound spilling out into the hallway. Thomas could hear the low hum of the noise, a confused buzzing in his ears. He watched the other children. They moved differently. They walked with their heads high, confident. When they saw Thomas, they stared. They noticed his old clothes. They noticed the way he moved a bit awkwardly, tilting his head to try and see better. Then it was time to go into the main auditorium. Frau Weber walked him onto the stage. The sheer size of it made Thomas's legs feel weak. There were hundreds of seats, and they were filling up fast. In the front row sat the judges. They were the experts, famous musicians, old professors, and critics from the biggest newspapers in the country. They looked stern. They wore formal clothes and sat with their arms crossed, looking like a row of angry crows. Frau Weber led Thomas to the piano at the center of the stage. It was a giant grand piano, black and shiny, much bigger than the old upright at home. It looked like a beast waiting to be tamed. Thomas sat down on the bench. It felt slippery and cold. He looked out at the audience. It was a sea of faces, all blurry in the distance. He felt a tap on his shoulder. It was one of the event organizers, a tall man with a thin face. Frau Weber was speaking to him, pointing at Thomas. She was explaining that he was deaf. Thomas saw the man's eyebrows go up. He saw the man look at him with pity, then turn and shout something to the judges. He saw the judges lean in. They whispered to each other. Then one by one, they looked at Thomas and smirked. Thomas couldn't hear the laughter, but he could see it. It was a cruel thing. He saw them cover their mouths with their hands. He saw their shoulders shaking. They were laughing at the idea of a deaf boy playing a piano. To them, it was a joke. It was like watching a fish try to ride a bicycle. One judge in the middle, a man with a gray beard and glasses, didn't even try to hide his amusement. He leaned back in his chair, loud and rude, waving his hand at the stage as if to say, "Get this over with." The audience started to notice the mood. The whispers spread like a ripple through the crowd. People pointed at Thomas. He saw the looks of confusion on their faces, then the looks of amusement. They were all waiting for a disaster. They wanted to see him make a fool of himself. The air in the hall felt heavy and thick with negativity. Thomas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. It was beating so hard he thought it might jump right out of his chest. His hands felt sweaty. He looked at the keys, but for a moment, they looked like enemies. He felt small. He felt like a fraud. What was he doing here? How could he compete with these people? The laughter in the front row grew louder. He could feel the vibrations of their mockery in the floor. It was a nasty, jagged feeling. Frau Weber stepped back into the wings. She looked at Thomas. She didn't smile. She just gave him a firm nod. "Remember," her eyes said, "let the music speak." Thomas took a deep breath. He wiped his hands on his trousers. He closed his eyes for a second and blocked out the mocking faces. He thought about the vibrations. He thought about the way the music felt at home when it was just him and the piano. He realized that these people were laughing because they didn't know what he knew. They thought music was something you heard with your ears. But he knew music was something you felt with your soul. He opened his eyes. He didn't look at the judges anymore. He didn't look at the audience. He looked at his hands. He placed his fingers on the keys. The laughter was still there, rippling through the air, a wall of sound he couldn't hear but could feel. The judges were relaxed, waiting for the comedy to begin. The audience was restless. The room was a powder keg of doubt and cruelty. Thomas sat up straighter. He planted his feet firmly on the floor. He felt the vibration of his own heartbeats, steady and strong. He was ready. The laughter didn't matter anymore. He wasn't there to please them. He was there to play. He took one last breath, held it, and then he let his fingers fall. The storm was about to begin. The air in the grand hall felt heavy, like the weight of the entire building was pressing down on the small boy sitting at the massive piano. Thomas sat perfectly still, his hands resting lightly on his knees. To the hundreds of people watching him, he looked like a statue. He didn't fidget. He didn't look around nervously. He just stared straight ahead, his eyes unfocused, seeing nothing but the silence that surrounded him. But the silence was only inside his own head. Outside, in the vast hall, the atmosphere was ugly. The laughter that had started in the front row was spreading through the crowd like a bad smell. People weren't just giggling anymore. They were talking openly. They pointed at Thomas's simple clothes, at his messy hair, and at the way he sat so strangely still. It was a circus to them. They were waiting for the clown to trip over his own feet. The judges, the so-called experts, were the worst of all. They were old men dressed in fine suits, men who had dedicated their lives to music. They believed they owned it. To them, music was a sacred thing that required perfect ears and a refined upbringing. A deaf boy from a dirty village was an insult to their stage. One judge, a man with a large red nose and a thick gray beard, leaned forward and whispered loudly to the man next to him. He didn't care who heard him. He tapped his own ear and made a ridiculous face, rolling his eyes back. The other judges chuckled. They adjusted their glasses, preparing to write a scathing review. They already had their jokes ready for their dinner parties later that night. Even the musicians in the orchestra pit, waiting to play after the solo performances, were shaking their heads. They held their instruments loosely, smirking at each other. They knew what it took to make music. They knew about timing and pitch and listening to the other players. They looked at Thomas and saw a disaster waiting to happen. One violinist even put down his bow, deciding to take a break because he assumed he wouldn't miss anything important. Thomas sat there, unaware of the specific words being spoken, but he could feel the mockery. He could see it in the sharp movements of their mouths. He could see it in the way their bodies shook with laughter. He could feel the vibration of their voices traveling through the floorboards and up the legs of the piano bench. It felt like 1,000 angry bees buzzing under his skin. It made his stomach twist into a tight knot. He felt the heat rise in his cheeks. He wanted to run away. He wanted to jump off the stage and hide behind the curtains where Frau Weber was standing. But then, he remembered the vibrations of the old piano at home. He remembered the feeling of the low notes shaking his chest. He took a slow, deep breath. He closed his eyes for a moment and shut out the laughing faces. He told himself that they didn't matter. Their noise was just wind. Their opinions were just dust. The only thing that was real was the music inside him. Slowly, Thomas lifted his hands. The movement seemed to catch the attention of the crowd. The laughing quieted down just a little, replaced by a low murmur of curiosity. They saw his hands were rough, the nails bitten short. They didn't look like the hands of a prodigy. They looked like the hands of a farm boy. He placed his fingers on the keys. He didn't strike them immediately. He paused. He felt the coolness of the ivory against his skin. He felt the stillness of the strings waiting inside the big black box. He was checking his connection to the instrument. In his mind, he wasn't in a hall anymore. He was back in his dusty parlor. It was just him and the piano. The judge with the gray beard let out a loud, rude huff of air. He looked at his pocket watch, bored already. He waved his hand at the stage, as if to say, "Get on with it." The audience saw this, and a few snickers rippled through the room. They were ready for the comedy to start. They expected a clumsy bang. They expected wrong notes. They expected silence. Thomas didn't move. He waited for the feeling of the room to settle. He waited for his own heart to stop racing. He wanted the rhythm in his chest to match the rhythm in his head. He pressed his foot down on the pedal. He felt the mechanism click under his shoe. He was ready. The tension in the room was tight, like a stretched rubber band. The people in the back rows stood up, craning their necks to see the freak show. The critics held their pens over their paper, ready to write the words silence or noise. The mockery hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Everyone was against him. To them, he was just a joke. Then, the boy moved. There was no warning. No conductor raised a baton. Thomas just threw his hands into the first chord. He didn't tap it gently. He slammed his fingers down with all the force he had. It wasn't a mistake. It was an explosion. The sound that came out of the piano was like a thunderclap. It wasn't just a musical note. It was a physical force. The grand piano, built of the finest wood and iron, shook violently. The sound blasted through the hall, cutting through the laughter and the whispers like a hot knife through butter. The effect was instant. The people in the front row, the ones who had been laughing the hardest, jumped in their seats. The judge with the gray beard was so startled that his glasses slid down his nose and his mouth snapped shut. The rude comments died instantly, strangled in their throats. The audience gasped. It wasn't a gasp of appreciation, not yet. It was a gasp of shock. The sound was so loud, so aggressive, and so unexpected that it felt like the floor had dropped out from under them. But Thomas didn't stop. As the first chord was still ringing in their ears, vibrating in the very rafters of the building, his hands moved again. He wasn't playing a children's song. He was playing a storm. His fingers were a blur. They moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a boy who lived in silence. He attacked the keys. He pulled the sound out of the piano. The experts were confused. They looked at their papers, then at the boy. This wasn't the awkward stumbling they had predicted. The notes were clean. They were sharp. They were perfect. But it was the power of it that scared them. He played with a ferocity they had never seen. He played with anger. He played with a desperate need to be heard. The laughter in the room was completely gone now, replaced by a stunned, heavy silence. The only movement in the hall was Thomas's hands, flying across the keyboard, and the rising and falling of his small shoulders. The joke was over. The music had begun. The first explosion of sound had sucked the air right out of the room. The laughter was gone, instantly replaced by a heavy, shocked silence. But Thomas didn't notice the change in the atmosphere. He couldn't hear the silence. And he couldn't see the faces of the audience because his eyes were squeezed shut in total concentration. He was nowhere near that grand hall anymore. In his mind, he had dissolved into the music. He was playing Beethoven, a composer who understood anger and sorrow better than anyone. Because Thomas couldn't hear the actual notes leaving the piano, he had to play differently than other people. Most musicians listen to the sound they are making and adjust their fingers to fix tiny mistakes. They rely on their ears to guide the tempo. Thomas didn't have that luxury. He had to trust his muscle memory completely. He had to trust that the hours of practice, feeling the vibrations of the old upright piano at home, would translate to this giant stage. And they did. His fingers moved with a scary precision. They weren't just hitting keys. They were dancing. His left hand jumped down the keyboard to play the deep, rumbling bass notes. He felt the heavy thud of the low strings in the wooden floor, traveling up through the bench and into his legs. It felt like the heartbeat of the earth. His right hand raced across the high notes, playing fast, complicated runs that sounded like a waterfall of crystal. Because he couldn't hear the softer sounds, he pressed the keys with extreme caution. His fingertips featherlight to ensure he didn't accidentally create a harsh noise. The music wasn't just sound. It was a physical story. The piece was full of ups and downs, moments of quiet, gentle sadness followed by sudden, violent crashes of thunder. Thomas attacked the loud parts with his whole body. He would lean forward, putting the weight of his small frame behind the keys, driving the hammers into the strings with a force that made the piano shudder. Then, in the quiet parts, he would pull back, his hands hovering like butterflies, barely touching the keys, creating a sound so delicate that the audience leaned forward in their seats, afraid to breathe, lest they miss it. In the front row, the judges were frozen. The man with the gray beard had stopped checking his pocket watch. His glasses were forgotten on the tip of his nose. His mouth hung open slightly, revealing his yellowed teeth. He was a man who had heard thousands of pianists in his life, professionals with perfect technique and polished styles. But he had never heard anything like this. This playing was raw. It wasn't perfect in the way a machine is perfect, but it was perfect in the way a storm is perfect. It had wild, untamed energy. The critics looked at each other, their eyes wide. They exchanged glances that said, "Asterisk, can you believe this?" They had come to write a joke, but now they were witnessing a miracle. The arrogance had drained out of them, replaced by a dawning realization that they were in the presence of greatness. They saw the sweat forming on Thomas's forehead. They saw the way his jaw was clenched tight. They realized that this boy was fighting a battle with every note. He wasn't just playing a song. He was fighting his silence, and he was winning. The audience was just as stunned. The people in the back rows who had been standing and craning their necks now sat down slowly. They didn't want to miss a single second. The mocking smiles were gone. In their place was a look of pure awe. The sound that filled the hall was overwhelming. It seemed to bounce off the high ceilings and seep into the walls. It was so loud that it vibrated in their own chests, just like it vibrated in Thomas's for the first time. The hearing people were experiencing the music exactly the way Thomas did. They could feel it. The music reached a high point, a chaotic storm of notes that seemed to swirl around the room like a tornado. Thomas's hands were moving so fast they were almost a blur. The strings inside the piano were singing and screaming, begging for mercy. The tension was unbearable. It felt like the music might tear the room apart. Every person in that hall was holding their breath, their hearts beating in time with the rhythm of the boy's hands. Then, suddenly, the storm broke. Thomas transitioned into the soft, slow section of the piece. His hands slowed down. The thunderous bass notes stopped. The melody became sad and longing. He played a series of high, lonely notes that hung in the air like ghosts. The change was so abrupt that it caught everyone off guard. It felt like the sun coming out after a terrifying storm. The beauty of it was painful. Thomas leaned his head back, his face pointed toward the ceiling. A small tear escaped from the corner of his closed eye and rolled down his cheek. He wasn't crying because he was sad. He was crying because he was free. In that moment, he wasn't a deaf boy from a village. He wasn't an outcast. He was a master. He was speaking a language that everyone could understand, a language that didn't need ears. He was pouring his soul into the keys, and the piano was singing it back to him. The final notes of the piece approached. Thomas could feel the vibrations of the music winding down, coming to a close. He knew exactly how much force was needed for the last chord. He didn't want to just play it. He wanted to make it last forever. He lifted his hands high above the keyboard, gathering every ounce of energy he had left in his small body. He brought them down simultaneously, striking 3 specific notes in the middle of the piano. He didn't press them hard. He pressed them firmly and then lifted his hands off the keys immediately, letting them ring. Bomb. The sound was deep, rich, and perfectly clear. It seemed to hang in the air of the grand hall, defying gravity, refusing to fade away. It was a beautiful, resonant chord that wrapped around everyone in the room like a warm blanket. Thomas pulled his hands back into his lap and sat perfectly still. He kept his eyes closed. He didn't move. He was listening with his hands, feeling the vibration of the final chord as it trembled through the wood of the piano and slowly died away. He waited until the shaking in the soundboard stopped, until the piano was completely still again. Only then did he open his eyes. He let out a long breath, his shoulders dropping as the tension left his body. He sat there for a moment, staring at the keys, surprised that it was over. He felt tired, but a good kind of tired, like after a long run. He turned his head slightly to look toward the wings of the stage, expecting to see Frau Weber telling him to stand up or bow. But the wings were far away, and the lights were too bright. He looked back at the audience, blinking in the glare. For a second, he didn't understand what he was seeing. The hundreds of people were sitting in the exact same position they had been in when he started. No one was moving. No one was whispering. The judge with the gray beard was still leaning forward, his pen frozen in midair. The critics were sitting with their mouths open. The entire hall was as silent as a tomb. Thomas felt a spike of fear in his stomach. Why were they so quiet? Had he played badly? Had he made a mistake and didn't know it? Did they hate it? The silence felt heavy and judging. He bit his lip, his hands starting to tremble slightly in his lap. He waited for the shouting, the laughing, the booing. He waited for them to throw things or tell him to get off the stage. He felt small again, like the boy who wasn't supposed to be there. He had given them everything he had, and now they were giving him nothing back. He wished he could disappear. He wished he was back at home, safe under his blanket. The silence stretched on, second after second. It felt like an hour to Thomas. He gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles turning white. He just wanted to run. He had been right, he thought. They were laughing at him. They were just waiting for the perfect moment to start. He lowered his head, ready to accept his defeat, feeling the crushing weight of disappointment settle over him. But then, he saw movement in the front row. Thomas sat frozen on the bench, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The silence in the hall was terrifying to him. He couldn't hear the music fading away. He only knew that the vibrations under his fingers had stopped. To his terrified mind, the lack of sound meant failure. He saw the hundreds of people sitting perfectly still, their faces blank. He saw the judges staring at him without blinking. He felt the hot sting of tears in his eyes. He thought they were angry. He thought he had made a fool of himself and his teacher. Frau Weber, he wanted to slide off the bench and run back to the dark safety of the curtains. But then, he saw movement in the front row. The judge with the gray beard, the man who had been so cruel and dismissive before Thomas started playing, slowly stood up. He didn't stand up to leave. He stood up and faced Thomas. Then, to the boy's amazement, the old man put his hands together. He wasn't clapping slowly. He was clapping hard, his hands striking each other with force. His face wasn't angry anymore. It was red, and his eyes were wet. He was nodding his head, a look of pure wonder on his face. It was like a spell had been broken. The person sitting next to the judge jumped up and began clapping too. Then the whole row of experts stood up. Within seconds, the entire auditorium erupted. It wasn't just polite applause. It was a deafening roar. Hundreds of people leaped to their feet. They were shouting, whistling, and stomping their feet. The sound was so loud that it seemed to shake the dust from the ceiling rafters. Thomas couldn't hear the noise, but he didn't need to. He felt the change instantly. The air in the room went from heavy and still to electric and chaotic. The vibrations in the floorboards, which had been silent during his performance, now came alive. The wooden floor under the piano trembled with the rhythmic thumping of hundreds of feet stomping in approval. The bench beneath him shook with the energy of the room. He looked out at the crowd and saw their hands moving in a blur. He saw their mouths open wide, faces turned up toward the ceiling. Screaming, he looked toward the wings of the stage and saw Frau Weber. She was standing there, her hands covering her face, but he could see her shoulders shaking. When she lowered her hands, she was smiling through her tears. She waved at him, beckoning him to stand up. Thomas realized then that he hadn't failed. He had won slowly. He stood up. His legs felt weak like jelly, but he forced them to hold him up. He stood in front of the massive black piano, wearing his simple, dusty clothes. He looked at the audience, really seeing them for the first time. They weren't looking at him with pity anymore. They weren't laughing. They were looking at him with respect. He didn't know what to do, so he just bowed. It was a clumsy, small bow. Nothing like the graceful bows the other children might do. He bent at the waist, his hands hanging down. Then he straightened up. The roar got even louder. He had made a mistake, he thought, worried he bowed wrong, but they cheered harder. He bowed again, deeper this time. The noise was overwhelming. Thomas felt a strange sensation in his chest. It was a vibration, but it wasn't coming from the piano. It was coming from him. He realized he was humming again, a low sound of joy matching the energy of the room. He felt a connection to these people. For the first time in his life, the wall between him and the rest of the world seemed to crumble. He didn't need to hear them to understand them. He could feel their admiration in the way the floor shook. He could see it in their eyes. The applause went on for a long time. Minutes passed, and still, the people refused to sit down. They wanted more. The judges, the same experts who had been ready to mock him, were now clapping until their hands were red. The man with the gray beard wiped his eyes with a handkerchief and blew his nose loudly. He looked at Thomas and pointed a finger at him, mouthing the words, "Bravo," over and over. Eventually, the organizers had to come out onto the stage to signal that the show had to go on. They gently guided Thomas away from the piano and toward the side of the stage. As he walked off, he reached out and touched the wood of the piano one last time. He whispered a silent thank you to the instrument that had given him a voice. Backstage, the atmosphere was completely different from before. When Thomas had first arrived, people had ignored him or looked at him with annoyance. Now, the other contestants were staring at him with wide eyes. Some of them looked jealous, but most looked impressed. The boy who had been warming up on the violin gave Thomas a shy nod of respect. Frau Weber was waiting for him. She didn't say a word. She just wrapped her arms around him and held him tight. Thomas hugged her back, burying his face in her coat. He could feel her heart beating fast. She was shaking with emotion. When she pulled back, she took his face in her hands and looked him right in the eyes. She didn't need to speak. Her look said everything. Asterisk, I told you. You did it. They heard you. Asterisk, the rest of the day passed in a blur for Thomas. He was given a special seat to watch the rest of the competition, but he found it hard to focus. Every time he looked at the empty piano on the stage, he felt a warm glow inside him. He watched the other children play. They were very good, technically perfect, but to Thomas, they looked small. They played with their heads. But Thomas had played with his heart. When the competition finally ended, it was time for the awards. The announcer called out the names of the runners-up. Children walked up, took their medals, and bowed. The audience clapped politely for them. But the air in the room was tense. Everyone was waiting for the main prize. The announcer walked to the center of the stage. He held up a large, shiny gold trophy. The room went quiet. Ladies and gentlemen, the announcer shouted, his voice booming, the winner of this year's grand prize, for a performance that shook us to our very souls, is Thomas from the village? Thomas froze. He looked around. He thought he had misunderstood. He looked at Frau Weber. She was pushing him toward the aisle. She whispered, laughing and crying at the same time. Thomas stood up. His legs felt shaky again. He walked down the aisle and up the steps to the stage. The applause started again, even louder this time. He walked past the judges. The man with the gray beard reached out and shook Thomas's hand firmly. He didn't let go immediately. He looked into Thomas's eyes and smiled a genuine warm smile. He squeezed Thomas's hand, passing a feeling of pride through his grip. Thomas reached the center of the stage. They handed him the trophy. It was heavy, made of gold and crystal. It felt cold and solid in his hands. He looked out at the sea of people. They were standing again. He saw his mother in the back row, waving a handkerchief over her head. He had never seen her look so happy. The announcer leaned down and asked Thomas if he wanted to say something. A microphone was held in front of his face. The crowd hushed to hear him. Thomas looked at the microphone. He knew he couldn't speak well. He knew his voice would sound strange to them. But he felt he had to say something. He took a deep breath. He didn't speak in long sentences. He didn't try to give a speech. He simply looked at the audience and said the words he felt in his heart. I cannot hear you, he said, his voice loud and a little raspy, but clear enough to be understood through the speakers. But today, I felt you. Thank you. The hall erupted once more. It was the loudest noise of the night. People weren't just clapping. They were cheering for the human spirit. They were cheering for the boy who had turned his silence into a gift. Thomas held the trophy tight against his chest. He closed his eyes for a moment and let the vibrations of their applause wash over him. He felt the shaking of the floor, the rumble of the air, and the beating of his own heart. In that moment, the silence was gone. He wasn't alone anymore. He was Thomas, the musician, and for the first time in his life, the world was listening.